Just before we are going to start this session, I would like to tell you, then you can relax. Everything is well taken care of. You will be in time at the airport. There is a bus foreseen for those who are flying to Prague at 12:50. So 12:50, which means that you have plenty of time to really experience the full morning program here of the WIRE 2017. And then for those who are flying to Vienna, the bus will be leaving at 13:40. Is that correct? I guess so, something like that. So everybody will be taken care of. You will be all in time for your flight. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how are you doing? Do you like the program so far? And your first impression of this beautiful country? And you know who we really have to honor, and that's why I really would like to appreciate if you give a warm, warm applause to Professor Radoslav Delina, because he's over there. Please step forward, please stand up. Rado? Yes. Now, thank you so much. You did a great job. And I know it's not only you, you have a wonderful team surrounding you, so this applause is for them as well. Thank you very much. So send them our best and our compliments for the great organization from beginning till the very end, I am so sure. Great. Now, we have been discussing and experiencing a lot yesterday, and a lot of discussions have been in place. Yes, we have seen great examples of socially responsible research and projects. And yes, we have trying to explore how creative industry can give that positive impact on our society. And yes, we have been trying to explore how we can close the gap between the widening and the so-called non-widening countries. And we're going to discuss this further on, and also when our rapporteur, Richard Tiffs, will have the stage later on this morning. But let's now start and see what we can see in the future. What are the developments we should try to face? And we have some expert on this topic. So we have some expert when it's come to the digital innovation development. And what I do suggest, we have 3 keynote speakers. They will all speak at around 15 minutes. I will give them their time, of course. And then I will introduce them here in the panel. And I must excuse Piotr Helexa. He would be here, but he is not able to be here, so, which is a pity. But, well, that is mostly for him a pity. And we will continue, of course, our discussion. Okay, no more time to waste now. I would like to introduce, and you saw maybe yesterday in one of the panels, Chris. Yes? Yes? Csíkszentmihályi. Oh, Csíkszentmihályi. Oh, no, really, this is what would happen. He said, do not even try to do so. Csíkszentmihályi, something like that. And no, it's not.
Thank
it's
you.
not.
You can call me Chris.
I call him Chris.
Call me Chris.
Oh, yes. I really said this is something I'm going to achieve, but I do not. Chris, I'm happy to have you here from the Madeira Interactive Technology Institute. Please send us your insights. Give me the insights for the first discussion.
Okay, thank you. If we could have the lights down a little bit on the projection, that would be great. So I was asked yesterday in the panel how I came from the United States to Madeira, and you know, it's a typo, a terrible clerical error. This is the laboratory that I've been setting up in Madeira. So it's a kind of a mixture of humans and robots. These are protest robots that I've been building so that protesters have the kind of same rights to protest without potentially being harmed that, you know, U.S. military does with drones. So the goal, we take kind of political safety very seriously in our shops. This is the protest robots being presented to the future generals of Portugal, just to kind of help them integrate already this kind of work. And this is some of the team that we've put together through the ERA chair. But what is it exactly that we're doing? I guess what I'd say is I would point to the well-known French philosopher Bruno Latour, who famously said that technology is society made durable. And this is what we're doing. So much of the conversation so far in this conference has been around the policy of technology, the social policies of technology. We had, really rousing discussion about rejecting technologies that make certain Californians very rich at the expense of everyone else. Couldn't agree more. But so far the conversation has kind of focused on that. And what I want to talk about today is Europe's position right now, because Europe is in a position where many of these things that many of the speakers called them innovations. For instance, yesterday's keynote described Airbnb and Uber as potential innovations for welfare. And I would just argue that if you're really thinking of them as innovations, you're stuck in a position where you're either accepting this thing or rejecting it. And usually by the time you decide to reject it, it's too late, like with Google. It's become so powerful in our society. So I'm trying to offer essentially another option, which is to think about the technology itself. Not to think about regulation of the technology, but to think about the technology as legislation in and of itself. So Bruno Latour gives this great example of the door closer. The door closer is a great example that you have an office and some people are always hot because there's air conditioning, but then the door is open, it stays open, they get hot. So they ask their management, can you put in one of these door closers? Does anyone have a word for these in their language? No one has a word for this in any language. So they, at first management, probably in German, but that's cheating because it's just actually a bunch of words. So what they do is they say, I'm hot all the time, I'm sweating into my keyboard. Can you please install one of these things? And management says no, it's too expensive, because that's management. And then people start complaining more and more, and eventually management spends the 40 euros and gets some labor to install it. And now the door closes automatically, and the hot people are much more comfortable. But the people who are too cold and like fresh air are now really unhappy. And it's not that every technology is a zero-sum game, but almost every technology is created by a group of people to make their lives a little bit more easy at the expense potentially of other people in the process. And so this is what Latour is talking about when he says that all technology is politics. And what I would argue is that, socially responsible technology is not only a question of policy. It can be a question of policy, and especially in extreme circumstances, but most of the time, it's a question of the technology itself. And this is the argument that I was thinking about yesterday during the keynote when he was talking about winner take all. So winner take all is emblematic of the moment that we're in. Google has taken all search. Android is taking all phones globally. This does seem to be a property. But Wikipedia took all for open knowledge definition, and that's great, because Wikipedia was designed as an inclusive, accountable system, and it's providing the knowledge for free, collaboratively created and providing it for free. So there's no problem necessarily with this winner take all. The question is, what is the cui bono? Who is benefiting from the technology, and how is the technology designed to include or not include certain groups? So every technology has embedded in it a whole set of political and social issues. This is just one example, and there could be hundreds more labels describing this. And the amazing thing is that almost none of these things are democratic. I sometimes make the argument that the Enlightenment was incomplete in the sense that it left technology out. Because the decisions that are made by these technologists have dramatic implications for all of us, but it's almost never done in public. It's almost never deliberated publicly. It all happens through kind of a market process that's hidden. Andrew Feenberg is a remarkable philosopher of technology currently in Canada. And I'll just read a couple of these sentences. Technology is power in modern societies. A greater power in many domains than the political system itself. I'm sorry, those of you from the Commission. I don't mean to make you feel inadequate. The masters of technical systems have far more control over patterns of urban growth, the design of dwellings, the selection of innovations, our experience as employees, patients, etc., than legislation ever will, because it's imbricated in the finest details of our lives. And this is the question that it should be considered a kind of legislation, but if technology is so powerful, why don't we apply the same democratic standards to it that we apply to other political institutions? And this is the question. And this is what we need to be kind of working on as technologists, engineers, regulators, involved in the capitalization process. This is Feenberg's description of what happens with technology. And engineers always talk about unintended consequences. And every engineering textbook has a couple of examples of unintended consequences that are considered very problematic. But it's actually a much deeper problem, and I was saying yesterday, that it's like Eskimos only having one word for snow. Of course you wouldn't only have one word for snow. We actually need dozens of words to describe how technologies have social impact, but unfortunately we just have that one kind of phrase, unintended consequences. Feenberg describes what he calls secondary effects, which is that this is kind of the formal definition of the problem. So the problem might be how to get people without a car from one place to another. And the thing is that in every place, by every team of engineers, by every company, by every time in history, the way that you would identify and fulfill the exact same design specification differs through a whole set of issues. If you look at cars in Italy in 1960, they were tiny. If you look at them in the US, they were huge. The US assumed unlimited resources and energy. But that wasn't ever part of a formal design description. It was the culture. And so these things he calls secondary effects. So for every one of the actual things that works, you have sometimes a much greater set of effects than the actual thing that's being designed. This might be a ride-sharing system that's a platform collaborative. Trebor Scholz's term for kind of a collective ride-sharing platform. This might be a traditional taxi system, and this might be Uber, where the big block is actually libertarianism and essentially trying to break the law. So this is kind of how some of us have been thinking about this process, that you have the design of innovation and technology over here that is typically focused on designing a device. And the device is designed to have these primary effects once it's released into society. And unfortunately, this is really where most of the energy happens. Even some of the remarkable, I would say, European-originated areas like participatory design tend to mostly stop here. They consider the labor, they consider the workplace, they consider the lives of the users, but they often really stop more or less at the level of primary effects. But then these secondary effects can be much, much, much larger. And so what ends up happening is when they get so large and, let's say, negative, eventually that causes, activism and political pressure, and regulation comes back, and that feeds back into the innovation process. But I would argue that especially when the innovation process is happening in a foreign country like Silicon Valley, that lag can be very serious. And it's also a problem because it's always in a reactive mode. It's always, the white blood cells looking at something that seems to be attacking your social values. It takes a while to understand what's going on. It takes a while to identify it. And then, by that point, they might have tremendous market share. They might have a lot of money. They might have access to governors. So this is too slow a process. And so I'd argue that without a different culture of engineering and education, we'll continue to be unprepared for unintended consequences, and that it's as important to work on the side of engineering and to understand how can you create a unique European voice as it is to try to legislate things after the fact. So, you design a phone, you think about, okay, it makes calls, it does SMSs, maybe you can have an app for mapping or something like that. But then someone thinks about a disruptive application like Uber, which is really more of a business platform than it is a technology. This is Tim O'Reilly. He's a kind of a famous technology. Evgeny Morozov calls him the meme hustler. He creates memes around technology, so he has a name for this most recent kind of set of innovations called the WTF economy. Before that, he coined Web 2.0. Before that, he saw the free software movement and made it kind of market-friendly by renaming it open source software. So he's very influential in terms of creating the kind of vision. And this is a direct quote from one of his writings. This wasn't a kind of a spontaneous conversation. He had time to think about this sentence. We need to ask ourselves whether the fundamental, social safety nets of the developed world will survive the transition, and more importantly than whether what we will replace them with, which is just a twisted logic, because he's already assuming that it's going to have to be disrupted. The safety nets will have to be disrupted. Not that anything else could happen. Not that one could control the amount of social disruption that these technologies are having. Just give up trying to control it. Let's just plan for the fallout. And this is the problem. You know, all of these technologies from Silicon Valley assume a basis of libertarianism. Even Carlos Moedas calls them innovative, and that's, you know, someone please get to him and tell him to stop, because it's like saying that, you know, Ronaldo's tax strategies are innovative, or that, you know, Volkswagen's clean diesel technologies are innovative. It's not innovation. It's figuring out ways to cut corners and to save money by disincluding or making other people's lives more tenuous. It's not a good strategy. So, you know, and I have many friends in Silicon Valley. You know, there's a lot I like about that culture. But you know, it's to paraphrase Arendt, the sad truth is that most social and economic disruption is done by technologists who never make up their mind to do good or evil. And we have to make that a much more conscious process. We have to make it so that every side of the kind of innovation strategy, every moment in development, a European engineer or startup can reach to a technology, or reach to a funding model, or reach to a marketing model, or reach to a distribution model that doesn't end up promoting values which in the end tax the system of social Europe. So let me just finish by showing a couple of examples of sort of technology resistance that I've done over the years. This is when the NSA really started to spy on people after 9/11. This was a DARPA hard project, $500 million a year to spy on everyone all the time. This was one of their original graphics. And so in my small lab at MIT, we started thinking, okay, what can we do about this? We think this will be really problematic. We don't think people should be spied on all the time. And so my student essentially thought this: the Bush administration, this is from 2003, it's almost 15 years old now. The Bush administration is being untransparent, they're breaking our, you know, violating our rights. Can we have everyone who has information about a governing official be able to anonymously contribute it online? Again, sorry to our representatives from the commission. He built it by being able to watch our political TV channels automatically to recognize faces and pull in the text of what was being said, and built a massive kind of system for keeping track of governing officials and then allowing people to leak information. This ran for about 2 years. We took it down because the NSA officially ended this program that we were responding to. Of course, most of the research went black. The NSA was a sponsor of the Media Lab, but they withdrew their sponsorship during this period. They said they were very concerned about my work. You know, that's pretty much when my chances of tenure disappeared. But I'll just show a little bit of documentation.
The U.S. government has more power to monitor the activity of Americans, but now citizens may have a monitoring service of their own. Ryan McKinley, a graduate student at MIT, has created an internet database that may help consumers keep tabs on government activity. He's our maverick of the morning. Ryan, it's good to talk to you.
Good to see you.
What exactly have you set up here?
Well, it's a system that has sort of two key parts. I've written a lot of parsers that get existing sources, so lots of public documentation, and then I'm working on ways for citizens to add more information to that so that we can really harness the collective knowledge of the American citizen.
It can be very invasive of the privacy of government officials. Aren't you concerned about doing to government officials what you're concerned they may be doing to others?
We live in a world where lots of personal information is traded about us daily. Credit card numbers, our financial histories. And so if it's legal to sell it kind of secretly behind us, it feels like it must be legal to share it publicly.
Hey, did you...
Feels like it must be legal. Interestingly, of course, we took it down, and about 9 months later, Julian Assange cited us as he launched WikiLeaks. That's become a much less clear thing to brag about recently. But then the next year, as Bush was being reelected, we decided to build a system for protesters because the US government was making it very difficult to protest in public space. So we said, okay, can we harness the newest technologies to make it easy for protesters to bypass police tactics and organize themselves ad hoc by essentially being able to pass quick, short messages between each other. And it was very, very successful, so successful that the phone companies started to block it. We put out a call to ask people to kind of help us create proxy systems like, you're supposed to use in Iran to bypass the phone companies, and they did. Turns out the team that helped us the most was working for a small company called Odeo, which liked the system so much and was actually using it that they pivoted and took our source code and created Twitter as a result. And so I'd make an argument here that the more you think about politics in your technology and the more you kind of explore the political possibilities, you actually have such a much longer runway for the possibilities of innovation. There's several other projects I could point to, but now you can see why I'm on ELBA. So let me just show one last project. I think I'm a couple minutes over. This is one of the key things that I think Europe needs to be confronting is not only creating these technologies for itself, but figuring out how to export these values. Over and over I see Europe slapping Google with fines. I see these kinds of, Europe being forced to respond to something from America because it doesn't fit their values. And so it's like an immune system that's always being burdened. I have to say, from the US side, we don't see it. There's a couple of German automakers in the South who have, good labor rules in their factories, which drives the Republicans crazy. But it's so minor in comparison. And so somehow, just in a question of survival, Europe has to figure out how to export this stuff so that it's harder for other governments not to have the kind of social policies that Europe does. And then it can influence. I'm actually working mostly in Africa right now. Another reason that Madeira is very attractive to me. And what I'm looking at is essentially what is the space for democratic deliberation for communities in Africa? And that's a space that is very difficult in most African countries. There's not a lot of media. There's very little local media. And so there's not the kind of tradition of newspapers and deliberation that you have in Europe. And so we've been looking at how to take what's actually the most popular technology. This gentleman is actually at a football game, and he's reporting back to a radio station in another region of the country just through a phone connection. Because radio is actually where about 90% of Ugandans are every day listening to news and information. There are structural problems with radio, though, which is that it's very large, and it tends to be in urban centers, and so people in the country are always listening to it. So we started thinking, what's a kind of a more rural approach towards FM that would allow radios to really serve rural communities? And we've created this thing called Radio as a Service, or RUTIO, which basically takes cloud telephony and small FM stations that have a 15-kilometer radius or so, but that connects people to the internet and to each other, and subsidizes all the kind of interactions that happen in the community for about €1 a day in these communities. And they sell much more than that in advertising, even in villages of 5,000 or 6,000 people. So this is all kind of designed in Europe, but then constructed in Kampala. And this is the gray ones are our current stations, and then the green ones and the red ones are ones that are coming up in the coming year, as well as in Cape Verde through a Mac Interreg project. Okay, thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you so very, very much. Wow, this is a great start of this morning. Whoa, it's amazing what you do bring us. That you say it is impossible, in fact, to you to not have a positive impact when you apply digital innovation, but you give us a good description how we mix up terms sometimes, that we talk about innovation, that you say, is this an innovation? It's just a new business model, nothing to do with innovation. So we must keep a clear eye on the defining of the terms we are using also here during this conference. Yeah, looking forward. I have some questions for you, but I'm sure you do have some questions for Chris as well. So please use the Slido. You remember? You still have it? Sorry? And verbally. Oh, yes, sure. You prefer verbally. Well, no problem. And we are not with so many, so there's no reason not to use just our mouth. Yes, great. Whatever way you want it, but we are going to address you some questions. Kieran, McCarthy, happy to have you here. You are the, not...
That's a very hard act to follow.
You can manage, I'm sure, from the European Committee of the Regions, Rapporteur of Digitising European Industry. Happy to have you here. Please give us your keynote, and then we will meet. It works, it all works.
Cool. Can I get that PowerPoint on? Good morning to everyone. And many thanks for the invite to this conference and also for the friendly hosting. I think everyone actually that I've met has been so nice, and everyone actually has so much to offer, I think, the EU project as well. In my presentation, I have pictures that I took of Košice over the last 2 days, and some of the pictures have no connection to what I'm going to say, but and some of them maybe do, some of them do, but I'm a geographer by trade, so Chris mentioned the word kind of social Europe. So apart from being a local government councillor in Cork in the south of Ireland, I'm big into the social consequences of some of this kind of technology as well. But I'd like to present the perspective of the Committee of the Regions. If you're not familiar with the European Committee of the Regions, it is a European institution. It has its own building to a degree in Brussels. It gives opinions to the European Commission and to the European Parliament. Sometimes our opinions are taken on board, and sometimes our opinions aren't. So we have this kind of dilemma at times within the Committee of the Regions. Those of you that were here yesterday would have actually heard the keynote speech by Markku Markkula, who's done a lot of really great work around kind of I suppose try to showcase best practice examples of kind of regional kind of innovation systems. And I suppose Chris in his presentation mentioned I suppose that politics has a long runway, and I think with us, we actually, when we actually look at innovation, there are so many different sides to it because we represent cities and regions, and citizens have kind of various kind of demands. And I think you mentioned kind of the various kind of definitions and the vocabularies, and I think citizens and the people working in tech have kind of created these vocabularies and definitions as well. Maybe sometimes as a smokescreen and sometimes maybe just to challenge people that we need to talk about these actually a lot more. So I'm delighted that you mentioned some of those. So we try to come up with practical kind of approaches, sustainable approaches. In one sense, I kind of described the work of the Committee of the Regions like acupuncture. I get acupuncture for my lower back every week because I've got a lower back problem because I'm tall. And so pins are put in kind of different places to develop the muscle. And the Committee of the Regions is also like that. We put pins in different parts of cities and regions to develop the muscle, to develop the cities and regions kind of stronger. If you didn't discover the main street, it's very beautiful. So it goes without saying that, I mean, the future of the European Union is increasingly kind of dependent on the ability to understand, embrace and utilise all aspects of the innovation society. It's also underpinned by like 500 million consumers. And I was saying yesterday to someone that I suppose kids that are now 4 or 5 years of age now can use iPads. When I was 4 or 5 years of age, we were kind of playing outside. So there's this kind of a huge kind of cultural kind of shift. And also, I suppose the age of what's the group known as the millennials. They want to be mobile. They want to move. They want to have that kind of freedom of movement. So this kind of new, this kind of industrial revolution. Someone mentioned Jeremy Rifkin yesterday. We had a great presentation last year in Bratislava with the Committee of the Regions, and in terms of this kind of fourth industrial revolution that we're kind of going through, that certainly there are new generations of digital technologies going through, and whether we call them innovations or something else, there's a sort of kind of a blurred line. But certainly I would have to say in the last kind of year, the discussion on big data and the use of big data is really kind of emerging, and I know I'm also a rapporteur on building a European kind of data economy, and there's a lot of issues around kind of cyber security and kind of the use of personal data, and also kind of the use of, I suppose, personal and non-personal data as well, so how we kind of move forward there. And of course, the European Union will pitch that, look, there's going to be billions of added kind of revenue if we kind of engage with this kind of digitization world. I don't think it's the be-all and end-all. It's not going to solve, we say, the unemployment problem within the European Union, but certainly there are positive elements kind of attached to it. Broken. What's going on? There's one of the sandcastle sculptures in the local park 2 days ago where I fell asleep. I came here early. But I think the importance that we need to converge kind of all sectors. I mean, there's a highly competitive European kind of digital industry. I'm lucky with the job I have in the Committee of the Regions. I get to travel a lot. I get to go to a different country every week. The last 10 weeks has been fairly manic. And everywhere I travel, whether it's from Portugal to here or from Denmark to Malta, everyone is trying to do their best and try to embrace this kind of European kind of digital industry. And everyone's actually looking for advice, and everyone's actually looking for assistance, and everyone's asking the question, am I on the right track? And I say to everyone, yes, you are, but we need to kind of pick up the pace. Because certainly the companies that Chris mentioned, like Uber and Google, they're many, many, many kilometers kind of ahead, and we say, in this kind of particular race. So in terms of recognizing disparity, the Committee of the Regions, in particular over the last kind of 2 years, many of our members actually come from mountainous regions and from rural regions, and many of them kind of pitched the idea that, look, we don't have broadband in our region. And I've met many, many young people across rural and mountainous kind of regions that are flocking into the capital cities to get access to broadband. And they say to me, we would actually stay within our region if we actually just had a proper kind of digital kind of infrastructure. And I suppose Chris also in his speech kind of mentioned that the regulatory kind of frameworks kind of need to be looked at. And in the Committee of the Regions, the last kind of 2 years, we've put through to the European Commission and the European Parliament six to seven kind of opinions on different things, like in terms of copyright and kind of the overall perspective on the digital kind of economy. And basically, my argument is that there's no point looking at this kind of regulation, the frameworks of the regulations every 5 years. Like, it needs to be done every nearly 2 years. The technology is changing at such a rapid rate that we need to keep kind of looking at it. We can't just kind of put it away and go, put a framework away and go, oh, we'll have a look at that now in 3 or 4 years' time. The technology doesn't work like that. Technology is like a chameleon in terms of an animal. It keeps changing. It keeps actually adapting. And we're always, in one sense, we're always going to be behind the regulatory kind of framework. What has been emerging as well is that there's been a huge amount of kind of European research on the digital kind of world. Some of it actually is coordinated, some of it kind of fits together, some of it's kind of fragmented. 2 weeks ago, I found myself in the European Research Centre just northeast of Milan in Ispra, and they gave a really, really great presentation. And we were asking kind of the question on how is this kind of the European Research Centre connected into the Horizon 2020 innovation projects? And they said, well, there's a lot of disconnection. Thank you. And there's connection and disconnection. So we need to work on that everyone actually can see all the different kind of chess pieces on the chessboard itself, and how they're actually all kind of moving. And also because we're kind of in a European Union with 28 member states at the moment, that interoperability in terms of how can we move this, I suppose, movement around the digital industry kind of between kind of countries. So where am I in my notes? And I mentioned kind of standardization kind of efforts. And also this kind of traditional cycle of development, testing, and standardization is kind of no longer kind of adequate. There's like there's a massive upskilling of the workforce is actually required. And I will probably get to education in a second, but just connected with this sort of massive upskilling of the workforce. I think our schools are way behind. I think a lot of the kids in schools, as I said, at the age of 4, they've got iPads in their hands, or they're embracing the technology. Our school curriculums are not embracing the technology, and we need to embrace the technology. And in one sense, we can actually say, oh, we don't want to embrace it, but the technology is moving. We are going to be swept by this tide, whether we like it or not. So it's nice to have a control of it as much as kind of possible. Can I go on there? It doesn't like your system. So you'll see here there's a statue kind of on top of, we'd say, what looks like a kind of an ogre. That there are certain countries that are ahead. There are certain countries kind of holding other countries back. So you've gone blank. And I mentioned, like, in one of my points as well is that, like, financing ICT in our regions is actually very, very, very important. Many local and regional authorities actually are unable to take full advantage of developments. There are technological kind of barriers to digital development projects in rural and sparsely populated areas. And they need to be taken into account. It shouldn't be a case of, oh, because we can't make money there, you're not going to get actually the technology or broadband. And I think local and regional authorities are also kind of in a huge position to create tailored demand and supply side solutions, including broadband rollout, digital economy, e-inclusion, e-government. Many local and regional authorities now actually as a kind of a basic element within their local authority have actually free internet on their main streets. And I know that's something that the European Commission as well is going to be rolling out to many, many other places through the work of Commissioner Carlos Moedas and so on. And also local and regional authorities are doing a lot of work in kind of e-government. So this sort of, they want to connect to the citizens more, where the citizen go online and actually kind of either pay a parking fine or find out about, we say, the changing kind of environmental kind of aspects of their city, or feed into data sets. And I think that's kind of very, very welcome. Still doesn't like me. I think I'm being blacked out now, Chris. So in terms of, let me kind of maybe push on to something that I have a huge interest in, which is like providing education and skill kind of matches. And I think we really need to address the digital kind of literacy and skill kind of shortfalls that we actually have out there in society and across kind of cities and regions. And certainly many of these problems are best dealt with at local and regional level to stimulate kind of more efficient and personalized services for the public as well as local businesses. There's a general figure out there that by 2020 we'll have 800,000 unfilled vacancies in the digital kind of sector. That's a lot of jobs in a sense, and unfilled kind of vacancies. So we need to train people up a lot more. As I said at the start, it's not the be-all and end-all in terms of it's going to solve the unemployment problems of the European Union, but it's still 800,000 kind of jobs that can actually be saved or can be actually given. And we certainly need to kind of to reconcile the imbalance of kind of skill shortages and ICT-related job vacancies by means of offering kind of appropriate training, apprenticeships, kind of placements. In my city, we actually have my city council actually oversees an education training body, and also it does a lot of work with our Institute of Technology, our Polytechnic, and our university. And I think sometimes in many cities, I think the word partnership was actually mentioned kind of yesterday. The Committee of the Regions is really trying to champion partnerships between kind of different sort of agencies. So I suppose not only we heard yesterday about the quadruple helix, but I think the quadruple helix, maybe as a term or as a definition, is going to change into something like biosphere. We hear about ecosystem. I like the word biosphere because it's kind of open, and that all the parts are all kind of dependent on each other. And I think certainly kind of going forward, we need to move away from this kind of siloization where you get university, council, civil society not working with each other. I think the digital kind of technology demands partnerships, and if you want to get ahead and if you want to be successful, you must have partnerships. You cannot get ahead if you're just within a kind of a silo kind of situation. And certainly the future jobs, what the Committee of the Regions have noted, will require an appropriate mix of kind of basic, soft and technical skills, digital and business-specific skills, that education and training systems at this moment in time are not kind of fully addressing. And certainly the Committee of the Regions very much kind of welcomes the European Commission's new skills agenda for Europe, and how it will provide a comprehensive framework for employability, including the need for digital and complementary key enabling skills. And also the Committee of the Regions is a huge champion of formal and informal kind of education. And I was delighted yesterday when I went to the creativity and culture session, the workshop upstairs, where many of the speakers there kind of said, look, it's not only, the thing about kind of using the technology going forward, it's not just about having a formal education or a university degree. Sometimes someone who's actually an artist can also kind of see different ways of kind of looking at the world and kind of bringing actually technology and actually business actually forward. And I think that's that's a very, very important point that I'd like to make. Certainly the Committee of the Regions has called for that each member state would guarantee to young people in cities and regions that they'd all have access to broadband and at a proper speed. I'm not just saying like 2 megabytes per second. There are many parts of rural Ireland that actually have 2 megabytes per second. I teach local history programs in schools in Cork City and Cork County. And I go into school and I go, can I use your YouTube? Can I have a Skype call with you? Can I have a conference call? And the schools go, no, we can't do that. We have the internet. Our national government is funding it, but they're only funding in a sense like 2G. And the European Commission in fairness to them, actually, are kind of working on 5G. But a lot of regions are on 2G, no mind 5G. So we need to kind of pick up the pace a lot more. And also we've kind of made the point that fundamental human skills such as literacy and person-to-person interaction are also kind of important. I think I was talking to someone yesterday who was saying that it's such a relief that like we all are actually, all our lives are dictated by mobile phones. And I've no doubt that many people are looking at their mobile phone and checking their emails, but we're all now working 24/7. Like we're checking our emails the last thing at night and the first thing in the morning. And the technology is is driving us to that we want to be more connected. But the question is, are we more connected? And I think someone gave a presentation yesterday kind of saying that we're not. And I think we need to really build a more kind of social Europe. There are so many opportunities. I mean, I'm lucky that I get to travel Europe and get to see all the different kind of opportunities, and there's so much out there. So we've concluded, the Committee of the Regions, and you've noticed that I've pitched kind of different ideas, different angles, maybe different runways as well, and that we try to take these definitions apart and try to critique them as much as we can. Like there are limits as well. I mean, I'm a local politician, so there are other competing demands in my city and region: housing, roads, environment, energy. But it's amazing that digital technologies can actually help all of those kind of different areas. And we need to kind of embrace it a bit more. Certainly embrace maybe there are negative sides, but there are a lot of kind of positives as well. And certainly local and regional authorities are the main target audience of, we say, the European Commission's work around kind of the use of digital industry. And we must be seen as kind of drivers and partners for its implementation. I had a lot more other nice pictures of Košice, which was my thank you to the people here. But I seem to be kind of cut off in the black. So hopefully you got something from that presentation. I look forward to discussing more or taking any questions that people actually have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. You did a great job, Kieran. It's not easy when the slideshow all of a sudden disappears. I'm looking to colleagues from Technique over there. Is the problem solved, you think, for our next speaker? Not really? Not for sure? Whoa, Mehran, Gül, I'm going to introduce you and telling you that you will have to do it without your slides. Is that possible? Sure. How flexible he is. Representative from the World Economic Forum. So happy to have you here during this WIRE2017 conference. Unlocking the digital value to society. Maybe you are trying still to fix it, that maybe at one point it will occur? Maybe, yes, maybe we can plug. Okay, well, that is really a thing, yeah. Mehran, I'm going to kindly ask you to improvise a bit, if possible. Please accept the apologies.
Thank you so much. It's just quite ironic because when I came in yesterday, I didn't actually have a presentation.
Oh, it's popping up. Oh, look at this. All of a sudden. Well done.
The stars are aligning.
Sorry, Kieran. I will just take a moment. To see if it really, truly works. Because you did prepare it yesterday. You were stating that you did not prepare it yet.
Yeah, it's just ironic because I made it last night. and I put everything on the slides, and then suddenly the slides are not working anymore. So.
Yeah. It would be helpful for you to have them, I can
absolutely,
imagine.
absolutely.
I can imagine.
So we'll
yes.
make another couple of minutes. I can dance.
It is.
If it comes to that, I will. I will not disappoint you.
Well, then you can take your time to just send a question via Slido, which I can then see, and then afterwards we can talk among each other. So just take your phone and whatever to Chris or to Kieran. Because how... I'm just wondering, do you have any time, because there... Just a second. Yeah, okay. Then we better.
Perfect.
Okay. It is 17,
Clicker
okay?
is not working now.
We are June 2017. Or am I crazy? No, it's okay.
The clicker is slightly problematic.
Do you recognize this as your presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Something is working.
great.
Great. So I'm glad my woes could lighten the atmosphere a little bit. My name is Mehran. I'm a project lead with the World Economic Forum, where I work on issues related to digital transformation. We really look at how technology is impacting both business and society. This is our second year at the WIRE conference, and it's quite a privilege to be here and to learn from all the various perspectives and learn about the different transformations that are taking place in the European region. In my presentation today, I'm going to talk about two broad things. The first one is the idea of the importance of actually measuring societal value and getting really specific about what we actually mean by the concept. We hear about, a lot of people talk about societal value, and there seems to be a hazy assumption that the audience and the speakers know what we're talking about, but what exactly is societal value? Are we talking about jobs? Are we talking about environment? Are we talking about people's sense of identity? So what is this notion of societal value? And if we are going to talk about it in a way that is relevant to policymakers and we expect policy action based on it, then we also really need to talk about whether it can be measured in any meaningful way. Look at the way that economic policy is formulated, and how, even if there are relatively imperfect ways of measuring economic growth, but still having a more rigorous approach to measuring progress has an impact on how opportunities are identified and how they are prioritized and the vigor with which they are pursued. So the first part of my talk is going to be about the importance of getting really specific about societal value and being able to measure it. And then the second part of my talk is going to be about three things within societal value. Jobs, which is taking up headlines everywhere we go. The environment, which in light of the recent Paris Declaration is a very important societal concern around the world, and arguably the backtracking that we're seeing on environmental targets in certain sort of core regions of the world. And third is a much more amorphous idea of digital trust and transparency. These are issues around privacy, issues around security, and how digital is addressing them, but also amplifying some of these concerns as well. So in terms of the impact of digital on society, the guiding assumption that we have in our work is that digital technologies are already changing society in profound ways. And you can see that with sort of the devices that you're carrying in your pockets, the way that you communicate with your friends, even the sort of technology that's present in your cars now. But arguably, the private sector has benefited more from digital transformation than society has. And we can see that by looking at the fact that, right now, the top 5 companies in the United States are all technology companies that were built within the past 3 decades. The fact that, it used to take companies about, on an average, Fortune 500 about 20 years to get to $1 billion valuation. Xiaomi did that in 18 months. So companies are getting much faster, much more agile, are able to scale much more given digital technologies. But how much has it really changed our education system? How much have digital technologies changed our healthcare system? How much has it really changed the way government functions work? How much has it changed urban infrastructure? And arguably, those changes have not happened at the same pace as changes in the private sector. There are a number of reasons for that. Some important reasons are that there are reasons related to skills. The best skills go and work for places that give them the highest returns, and that just happens to be the private sector for the moment. But in our view, one of the biggest reasons also is reasons of unaligned incentives. When the private sector sees a certain value to a certain technology, it can act very well as a self-interested, self-organized group that goes out and captures that value. But at the same time, if there's immense value that society sees in things such as, for instance, using sensors in cars, so ideas that have a lot of value for society but not for business, there's a tragedy of commons there where the society cannot organize itself as an organized actor to actually go after that value. And so what do you do about those instances? And that's what really our work at the forum has focused on over the past 2 years. What we really mean by value at stake is trying to calculate the value of any given digital initiative to a certain society. So for example, if we were to have usage-based insurance in the United States, usage-based insurance in cars means if you use sensors in cars to actually track how a person drives, and based on their driving behavior, you determine what premiums they're going to pay, what their liability is going to be in instances where they get into a car crash, etc. So if that initiative, for example, were to be implemented in a territory like the United States, how much would that impact the business sector, automotive sector, and insurance sector in terms of operating margins, in terms of profits, and similarly, how much would it impact the society in terms of lives saved, jobs saved, accidents avoided, etc. So we mapped around 135 initiatives across 4 sectors: automotive, electricity, logistics, and consumer industries, to look at what would be the value of these initiatives for business and what would be the value of these initiatives for society. Unsurprisingly, for most of the initiatives that we looked at, the value to society was far greater than the value to business. However, only the initiatives that had significant value to business we actually saw being implemented in practice, whereas others that had immense value to society, such as real-time supply and demand monitoring in electricity, or shared crowdsourcing sort of logistics warehouses in the logistics industry, those we didn't really see happen in practice because the incentives were very unaligned. According to our analysis, in only 4 industries, if we were to implement these 135 initiatives, there was about $8.4 trillion of value that could accrue to industry, but the value to society outstripped much further, and it was around $12.7 trillion that we saw in terms of value to society. And again, what we mean by value to society is there are 3 distinct aspects to this. What is the value to an individual in terms of saved costs? For example, if you have e-commerce that introduces a lot of price transparency in the market, and multiple vendors cannot charge you different prices. And due to that transparency, the consumer benefits directly by being able to sort of get a very consistent price across different vendors. So that would be a direct value to the individual, which we try to measure. The second is the value to society as a whole, and that would include things such as jobs, for example. How many net jobs are going to be created? What is the wage polarization that we're seeing as a consequence of this initiative? Is the polarization going up or down? And then finally, we're looking at the value to society in terms of the environment, which would have things such as the impact in terms of CO2 emissions, for example, impact in terms of natural resource use. And we try and quantify all of that into one number, much in the same way that GDP tries to capture economic value in a given society. So these are some of the ways in which we have tried to value different initiatives and the impact that they can have on society. And what we really ended up coming up with was this sort of compass model, where on the left we have some initiatives that have tremendous value to society, but very little value to industry. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have initiatives that have a lot of value to industry, but perhaps not as much value to society. And the size of the bubble reflects the overall value that is at stake. So to give you an example, in the crowdsourcing of logistics space, the value to society is about 500 times more than the value to industry. Crowdsourcing logistics means that you have a peer-to-peer model of delivering packages, where right now, for example, it is you order something on Amazon, DHL picks it up, and it delivers it at your doorstep. But in order to shorten that time to one-day delivery, you have to look at something that's much more like Airbnb or Uber, where you have peer-to-peer deliveries where private citizens go and fetch your packages and then deliver them to you on the same day. These sorts of initiatives have a lot of value to the society because you get your packages faster at a lower cost. It's really on-demand economy, but at the same time, it takes away a lot of profit pools from the industry. In the form of a lot of business being taken away from a lot of existing operators in the logistics space. So we have around 135 of these initiatives that we've mapped out and valued, and now we're working with a number of different governments to see how we can implement these in practice. We've been working notably with the government of Denmark, with the government of India. We're also working with the government of the UK, because one thing that this really does on the highest level is give policymakers a sense of the size of the prize, where initially you might think that making a move in the logistics space and in the e-commerce space might be of similar value as a given policymaker when you're trying to sort of make policies or when you're trying to come up with incentives for the industry. But just looking at these initiatives on a compass gives you a very clear idea of prioritization of which initiatives should be prioritized first. So this was just a quick overview of this framework on the value at stake that we've been trying to develop at the World Economic Forum. Oops. Technology had to go wrong at some point. So what we're really trying to do over here is trying to develop a common language that policymakers and technologists can use to identify the right initiative, to implement it, and to be able to get the value for society that lies dormant, but nobody's really making an organized effort to go after it. So this is a big part of our work, but I wanted to make sure that I don't leave out some of the more thematic aspects of what we see happening in the societal space when we talk about digital. So now I'll just quickly talk about three main concerns that we come across. The first related to jobs, the second that relates to the environment, and the third that relates to trust and transparency. When we talk about jobs, there's a big concern that while digitization is creating entirely new roles and it's creating entirely new industries, and in some cases it's creating entirely new sectors of the economy, such as digital security and data science, there's an immense concern out there that digitization is also going to eat up a lot of jobs as well. And especially middle-income jobs that are very easy to automate and that rely on routine tasks. And one of the interesting things about this, however, is that there's really no consensus on how many jobs are going to be lost and in what sectors. There are studies out there that suggest that there will be about 27 million jobs that will be lost over the next 5 years, and there are studies that suggest that there will be about 2 billion jobs that will either be lost or be changed as a consequence of digital transformation. And sort of our broad level take on that is that one of the reasons why there's so much pessimism around this topic is that it's very easy to predict the jobs that are going to be lost, but it's very easy to estimate the jobs that are going to be lost, but very hard to predict the new jobs that are going to be created in the digital economy, because we just don't know what new industrial sectors are going to emerge. There was a similar debate around this that emerged when the internet came up 20 years ago. That people were very concerned about the internet eating up jobs, the internet leading to the demise of newspapers, for example. And although all of that did happen, we also saw that the internet created vast new industries that became the source of new jobs in the economy. But there is a big concern that the new jobs that the digital economy creates require a higher level of technical expertise than the jobs that it's taking away. And so the question is really about skilling and reskilling the workforce, which is a question that predates digitization. The question of education and how do you create the population with the right skill set is one that goes back beyond the past 30 years, which is the time frame that we talk about when we talk about the digital revolution. So the question is more about education and skilling rather than that of jobs per se. And while we do certainly see a hollowing out of routine jobs, we don't really foresee the overall number of jobs being eliminated in the economy simply because we don't know what new jobs might be created. And also there's a big difference between different sectors. If you look at the automotive industry, then we're probably looking at a lot of jobs being made obsolete because of automated cars. But if you look at the logistics industry, for example, we do expect a net increase of 2.1 million jobs in the logistics industry up till 2025. Simply because as more and more commerce moves online, all those orders and packages have to be delivered and processed by more eyes and hands. So in terms of jobs, our main message simply is that it's more about understanding what the future jobs requirements are and putting into place the institutional mechanisms that are going to ensure that people are going to have the right skills for the jobs of the future. And this means changing education institutions as we understand them today and having more of a focus on lifelong learning, where you fuse education functions in organizations as well, where instead of being educated for the first 25 years of your life, working for the next 30, and then retiring for the next 10, we will have to see a much more different model of how people conceive of a career, how they conceive of education, and how they conceive of life more broadly. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is the environment. Over the past 30 odd years, what we've seen is that for every 1% increase in global GDP, we've also seen a 0.5% increase in CO2 emissions. And we're not really seeing this relationship between economic growth and and natural resource use getting decoupled as a consequence of technology. Not just yet. This is an issue of massive concern for us because societies as a whole are beginning to wake up to this massive trade-off that they've had to make in the past between economic growth and preserving the environment. And more, the preference is for the latter rather than the former. As societies start getting richer, they get more and more concerned about things like the environment. But we're not really seeing natural resource use slowing down even in the digital economy. Arguably, however, it's the natural resource use that we're seeing is increasing as a consequence of digitization. And some of the two big contributors to this are e-waste. As hardware cycles are getting faster and faster, people used to change their phones every 5 years. Now they change it every year, every 18 months. People used to change their computers every 7 years. Now they change it every 2 years. That's creating a lot of e-waste. And according to the UN, about 40 million metric tons of e-waste was discarded in 2014 alone. Similarly, the energy that powers digital devices still comes from the same energy sources as the sources that we were using for all of our other devices. About 75% of the global energy use comes from non-renewable resources, and that share is not going down at present. And data centers, for example, are taking up 2% of global electricity, and it's proceeding at a very fast pace where that rate is increasing by 12% every year. And even though we talk a lot about circular economy and bringing sustainability into supply chains, is that my time? Or I'll go through this very quickly. So we're not really seeing the circular economy really taking place in a very meaningful way within the digital economy. Only about 27 companies right now use 100% renewable energy in their operations. And we've listed some of them over here: SAP, DataPipe, Motorola, and Apple. Finally, I come to the question of building trust in the digital economy. Trust has, so arguably in some ways, trust has increased in recent years because of digitization. The way that you look at the younger generation sharing their personal information online on portals like Facebook, for example, means that there's relatively a higher level of comfort with sharing personal information that the present generation has compared to the previous generations. Social media has made it easier to share poor customer service and unpopular business practices with global platforms. Think about all the times that an airline made a mistake and how pretty much instantly those faults were made global, and those were massive PR disasters for them. There's a rise in peer-to-peer and sharing economy with Airbnb and Uber. There are issues with these services, but at the same time, they also offer people who provide services on these platforms with opportunities to make a living in a much more flexible way. And public institutions have also opened up traditionally closed-off processes. Think about all the politicians who are now on Twitter, because it's impossible to carry out policy without being directly in touch with the populace. But at the same time, we have massive issues around privacy and security, where people's trust in digital technologies and the ability of companies to actually keep their data secure is getting lower and lower. According to a recent Pew Research poll, only 11% of Americans were confident that companies are using their data in a responsible way. The second big concern that we have is around algorithmic governance. Many services out there, such as Facebook, nudge you into coming across certain types of content, which creates stronger and stronger bubbles that you begin to recede into. And as more and more of your functions, public sector functions and private sector functions begin to be determined by automatic algorithms, what does that mean for human agency and real human choice and human independence? Some of the concerns that we have are around misunderstandings of the freemium economy, where if a certain product is being provided to you free of cost, then you are essentially the product and your data is the product. Much of this is being done without people being aware of what the consequences of this really are. So being able to really educate the average user about how the data is being used and what consequences this can have for them. And then there are some issues around digital ethics, which are at least 4 to 5 years in the future, which have to do with decisions that eventually we cede to technology rather than making ourselves. So for example, if an autonomous car gets into an accident, whose liability is it? And at the same time, if real time, in the moment, an autonomous car has to make a decision between saving the person in the car itself versus saving a person in another car, and it's the automated technology that makes that decision instead of a human being, then how comfortable are we with that exactly? And again, where does liability lie over there? And the second set of concerns is around human-digital integration, where as technology, as people begin to accrue technology more and more, not as an object that they use, but as an object that's embedded in their own bodies, how does that map onto existing inequalities that we see in terms of capabilities around the world? And what does that really mean in terms of who we are as human beings and how we sort of self-identify? So those are some of the quick, well, not very quick anymore, but some of the issues that we are working on at the forum, and I'm looking forward to discussing them in more detail on the panel. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Wow. Mehran, please be seated here at the panel, and also Chris and Kieran, if I may invite you here as well. As Piotr Pluta, yes, you are there, and Pavol Mirossay, please step forward. Oh, ladies, gentlemen, do you agree with me that now we have the feeling we have to stay for another at least 2 or 3 days? Because there's so much to discuss. There is no time to waste. Things are going so quick. Well, Mehran, you are really... Everything goes wrong here. Okay. Now, we are going to try to find even more, because that was you said we must develop and try to speak a common language, because transformation is going so quickly and it's so new and so with an open end that we must make sure that we keep each other on board, that we are trying to develop that same language. So that's what we are going to do for the next 3/4 of an hour, because that's the time we have, so no time to waste. I have got 2 questions, but as said by representatives from the Commission, we do not need the Slido. We can, the Slido, but if you do not want to use it, then just yell. That's fine, and then I will notice you. First of all, Piotr, may I start with you? The Cisco Director Corporate Affairs. It was Mehran who said, oh, it is quite easy to predict the jobs we are going to lose, mostly in the middle income. Jobs what you can automate quite easily. But it's much harder to predict what new jobs will occur. Now, what is your reflection on this when it comes to jobs? Because I know this is one of your key issues.
Yes, thank you, and good morning. It was a fantastic opening, I think, this morning. So thank you for the speakers. Maybe I will make a bit of introduction.
Great.
Within corporate affairs in Cisco, we operate a corporate social responsibility program, which is called Cisco Networking Academy, which enables public education to catch up with technology. I can imagine that some of you maybe have heard about this program. If you didn't, you can have a look at this. Now, looking at the jobs, the main objective which we have in the program is to build these skills which are needed and will be needed in the future by the industry, especially digitizing industry. We have gaps today. Kieran, you have mentioned about the several 100,000 of jobs in Europe which are unfilled because of the skills gap or mismatch. We observe that there are even probably more individuals at risk today, or maybe even in the close future, because the technology is accelerating. I remember one example which was shared on one of the conferences, was quite interesting. Do you know what is the most popular job in the United States?
I don't know. Does anybody know? The most popular in the United States?
The most popular, you know.
Data analytics.
Truck driver. Truck driver. So the most Americans work in a truck driver job. Now, think about what will happen with truck driving if the automation and autonomous cars are coming. Mm-hmm. So this is about the predicting what will happen with the jobs. Now, the whole industry will be developed in order to make those trucks automatically, safely cruising through this big country. A lot of probably new services will need to pop up, and the business will do this relatively fast, as we have been talked about this as well. Can we predict today? A little bit, yes. Some of the automation, Internet of Things jobs are already being defined. We are in designing the future of our program. We are doing exactly that. We are looking into 3 years ahead and think about, okay, so which skills will be needed massively. I think the very important element here is that it will be not about the most smart and the fastest developing individuals. We have people who are already thinking about these technologies. These skills will need to be popular. They will need to be everywhere, not only in the smartest teacher, smartest school, but in every school, in every individual will need to have the basic understanding of digital technologies, and not only from the perspective of how to consume digital products or solutions, but how to design and introduce, how to build it. Like today, the digital skills are not that specifically taught at schools. We are talking about regions here. We have introduced recently, together with the Ministry of Education in France, a completely new course for children about internet, so that they can understand internet not as what do I have on my iPhone or iPad, but how is it created? So who is doing that? What can be my role in the future about the internet at home, internet at institutions, or on international internet? And this will be introduced to 11, 12, 13 years olds in France, everywhere.
Are the teachers ready for this?
No.
Are we, as policymakers, ready for this?
There are some good steps
You said
done.
no? No. Kieran, are we?
I can
Because
tell you, no, we are not, because just simple example. Interaction with digital content for youngsters. If we would like to make it like for everybody, can we introduce such system? Not really, because we need to have a parental consent or some terms and conditions acceptance. And then it means that still a certain group of young people will be not included in the program.
Yeah.
So the policy changes have to take place on this as well. And but what I like a lot is that there are people, there are governments, there are private-public partnerships which are piloting really important solutions and really important changes. And hopefully very soon we will see this as a more
Chris, may I ask you to reflect on this? I will come to Pavol in a minute. Chris, because this now, again, is a good example of a nice initiative in France in this particular case. And yesterday as well, it was brought up several times that we do see perfect initiatives that you say, well, this is the right fight, this is the way we should go. But it's so hard to skill them up or to spread the good news. What is your reflection on that? That you see the right things happening, but just pinpointed somewhere.
Yeah,
How to make a
I mean,
movement out of it.
I haven't seen details of this program, so I can't actually say whether I think it's the right thing or not.
But in general,
yeah.
maybe that you.
Well, I mean, again, I'm left. You know, in 1985, the institution I used to work at, the Media Lab, was created specifically to look at how digitization was going to be impacting various industries. Right, 1985, you know, 30 years ago, and it was, you know, what's amazing about it. I mean, it was actually 83, but what's amazing about it to me is that you look at these lessons are so clear. The truck driver lesson. I mean, this has already happened in so many industries already. You know, I mean, Bertelsmann was one of our sponsors. I remember when, you know, a Napster was launched. You know, I mean, like you see these industries falling, and yet we seem to be having so much trouble getting ahead of it. And I think that part of what you have to understand is that there is actually, it really is a battle with two sides. It's not as if these technologies are just coming out and then we're reacting to them. It's that some people and forces are pushing this kind of disruption. And then you're saying, okay, let's educate, you know, kids for digital skills. That's fine, but you know, it's always going to be 15 or 20 years late if that's your approach. I mean, the question is, how do you actually take those forces that are, you know, pushing things like the automatic driving without any strong sense of social obligation, any kind of sense of how to integrate those workers? You can't let those things be decoupled, because then you're always playing catch up. So I mean, you know, scaling a particular program like that is interesting to me, but what's much more interesting is actually getting there 10 years earlier or 30 years earlier so that you don't have to do that work in the same kind of way.
Great. I'll keep this one in mind because we get back to this. But first, I would like to welcome you, Pavol. Great to have you here from the IT Valley.
Thank you.
Košice. Yes. What is your biggest challenge now when you look upon the future, your vision?
I think it was already mentioned over here. If we are talking about the kids, small kids, exactly. I have a niece and nephew which are 10 years old, you know, and even I cannot keep up with them according, the technology. They're using Snapchat. I don't understand Snapchat that much, And when I think about it, it's that the technologies are changing so dramatically, and kids are changing because of it also so dramatically in terms of communication and in terms of education. But the education system just cannot keep up with this pace, of the technology. So I think this is the biggest challenge, that we need really maybe make policies that really will make a pressure on the educational system to be changed and to keep up the pace with the pace of the changing world of technologies.
Yeah, okay. Let's try to get back to Mehran's story that you said, well, and it was a very, like all your contributions were of great value, but measuring the societal value. There is a lot done by you, by the forum, by Accenture in cooperation with. And then there is something key in your contribution that you say, if you measure it and if you see it on a slide, you are really a bit like, oh, this is the way it is. Only when the initiatives do have business value, then they are implemented. But the societal impact is number 2. And that is exactly what you are saying. Like, there are drivers and they go without too many hurdles. They just can go ahead. And that is something we should try to change, at least, to make it that positive societal impact when it comes to the regions, when it comes to the EU. Now, let us try to get answers to these questions, because we know that this is the way the world turns. This is us, human beings, with that new dimension of technology brought to us by ourselves. But now we must try to really tackle the challenges we do have as a society, as a world. And then it comes to inequalities. It comes about, we talk about poverty and things like that. What can we do in this beautiful group of delegates from this WIRE conference? What are the first steps to make it? We must be aware of it. You made us aware of it, and we are aware of it. But what can we do when it comes to the Commission, to the regions, to local governments, policymakers? What would you suggest? Kieran, I'll first go to you. What tomorrow? We are flying home, and on Monday, what are we going to do?
I would think that the investment in digital technology is, yes, towards businesses. There seems to be like a hierarchical scheme. I honestly believe that in the morning, the EU should actually invest in young generations and kind of digital technology. So we invest millions of euros in Horizon 2020. Perhaps 10% or 20% of Horizon 2020 should actually go into local schools, so the businesses or the projects that are getting Horizon 2020 funding, the schools nearby also should have a role in that. So I think the EU could actually probably solve the problem, we'd say, of catch-up within a kind of maybe a year or two. I think the technology is so far ahead in terms of the 5 and 6 year olds is so far ahead in terms of that they earn this kind of technology and they want to harness it and use it. But I just think we as a generation, we haven't gone through. I mean, when I was going to school in the 1980s, we had a big, huge computer in the corner of the classroom, and only one person could actually use it.
Old school, Kieran. Old school.
Huh? Yeah, I think we're too old school. The technology is moving at a rapid rate, but I just think it just actually needs investment. I mean, I very much welcome the fact that France is rolling out a national educational program in different uses of technology and the responsibilities actually behind it. It should be rolled out right across the European Union. If we have Horizon 2020 funding or COSME or other kind of projects that are being invested in science and innovation, there should be a connection into the schools, and that connection actually isn't there.
But then Chris is still claiming we are too late.
We'll always be too late. We'll always play catch-up. The technology, like Pavol mentioned Snapchat. I mean, I've friends, young kids that are also on that. And I've no doubt that next week there'll be another different form of Snapchat. Like Facebook I think is dying a death. Hopefully there are no investors here in Facebook. But like many people are actually going, well, we're just fed up with Facebook. We're kind of moving on. I actually have friends who are actually just going off Facebook going, I'm just fed up of it, I'm bored with it. It's like I'm sick of seeing my friends putting up pictures of their dinners or their lunches or their holidays or their kids. And they actually want something more real, they want something more tangible. So there is a movement out there as well that people actually want to live their lives, and I think it's actually something that you mentioned as well. So look, I think the question that you asked, what should we do? We should invest in the schools and might go back to the point that if we're investing in science and innovation at a very much in hierarchical kind of projects, millions of euros, much of that is actually not being communicated, and certainly not getting into local schools who know nothing about science and innovation projects in their local area.
Mehran, what would you suggest with all the knowledge you brought to us?
I think I think we're going to see a fundamental change in paradigm where I think traditionally governments were seen as entities that look after societal interest and the private sector was seen as entities that looks after private interest. But I think that dichotomy is no longer tenable for a number of reasons. I think that hinged on the idea that the government is just much more capable of the private sector. If you look at 30 years ago, 40 years ago, sending spacecraft into space was something only the government could do. A private sector could not do that. Building large dams was something that only government could do. The private sector could not do that. Creating a database of registry for every sort of person that lives on the territory, that is only something that the government could do. The private sector could not do that. But digital technologies are having this democratizing tendency where things that previously only large organizations like the government could do, now even sort of small actors working out of their garage can do that as well. The largest identity database in the world is not controlled by some government or intelligence agency. It's controlled by Facebook. The best big data organization out there is not a government, it's Palantir. If you look at who has the biggest ambitions for space exploration, it's not NASA, it's SpaceX. If you look at the company that has the biggest mission to sort of change, make a transition from non-renewable to renewable sources of energy, it's Tesla, not the US Department of Energy.
But if this is so true, then how are we going to convince all these names you are mentioning that societal impact should be key, not only the business impact?
So I think there's a change in license to operate where how a company is being perceived is becoming very central to whether or not people are going to let them operate. If you look at the example of Uber recently, for example, problems of the internal institutional culture of Uber were not internal problems anymore. They were problems that since people thought that they were not operating at a level that was equivalent to that was expected by society, the CEO had to resign and the company is in dire straits. I think 30 or 40 years ago, it probably would have been seen as Uber's internal problem. So things are changing and companies, how they are perceived is very central to their license to operate and their survivability as well. And increasingly, just in terms of motivations why people work for companies, if you look at sort of the millennials, they don't want to work for a boring old company that only makes profits. The idea that it's a company that's changing the world, that has some sort of positive impact. I know at times this gets very public relationally and very markety, but I think there's a desire among people to work on something that's actually meaningful rather than something that simply adds.
I'm going to check this if this is the case in a rural area somewhere in Slovakia. The 16-year-old girl somewhere in a beautiful village here in Slovakia. What's her dream? Is her dream to work like Mehran says?
I think really what Mehran said is right, because if we're, for example, we're struggling, or everybody in IT sector is struggling with the senior guys, to have good IT stuff. And if we are asking those people what are their intention for work, what are the projects they want to work, it's exactly what Mehran said, that they want to have projects which are interesting. They're no longer interested in maybe bigger salary because the difference between the companies is not so huge, but they are interested really on the project itself. And if it's something that could also help the society, it's even better for them. So what we are looking for is, and it would be really hard also for IT companies because there would be boring jobs, but the senior guys would look for something more interesting. So this is really challenging for also other companies.
Okay, Chris first, and then I come to you, Piotr.
I just have to bend over the page for a second, Mehran, because you said the best big data company or data management company was Palantir. And I think that's a perfect, you just, I think, self-refuted your own point. You can't have these companies holding public trust because their responsibility isn't to the public. And you know, Uber's responsibility was never to the public. They will just have to do a couple of things and then they'll be fine as a business. But they will never be involved in the public trust. I think actually there's a parallel development to all of this, which is, you know, what I was talking about Wikipedia or Linux, that there are, what we've seen now is that there's actually a very different kind of structure of how large-scale, very complicated products can be built that is very, very different from the corporate model. And so I would argue that that's where we need to be focusing our energy on, is these distributed work practices that can serve public goods, that by their definition are not a corporation or an entity that has to look out after itself. It's a project, but it's a group of disparate individuals, just like democracy is. Mm-hmm. And so I would argue completely the opposite of what you said, that these companies are never going to be in the public interest. And in fact, we need to be building those technologies like Linux and like Wikipedia, where you say, this is a technology that can actually, because of the way it's structured and the way that work happens, represent the public good and interest.
Okay, Mehran. Yes, you. Yes.
So basically following your...
We cannot hear you. Please step forward, that would be nice. Yeah.
Following what you were saying, are we moving from being citizens to being buyers? That's my question.
Okay, are we moving from citizens to buyers? But first maybe a reflection on from citizens to Mehran, but maybe first to Mehran. But maybe first a reflection on what Chris said, because he is claiming the complete opposite.
I think I just became the embodiment of corporatism over here, so I'll try not to act the part. But I think the question is the opposite, which is, I think we're already consumers, and how do we go from being consumers to being citizens? And you know, there's evidence on both sides of the fence right now. You know, some people say that, you know, with the advent of technologies like Palantir, for example, you know, people are being observed much more closely, and there's no place to hide. But at the same time, you know, what impact does an outlet like Twitter, for example, have on people's ability to organize and protest? In many places around the world where governments have controlled national infrastructure for communications, it's been places like Facebook or Twitter, for example, that people have used in order to organize and still come out. So I think I take Chris's point as well. I think it's slightly messier than that. It's not that everything that's corporate is something that's being used to sort of establish dominance of some sort of hierarchy, and everything that is non-profit is something that is a means of self-expression and good. You know, there are products that are coming out from large corporations that are being used as tools for subversion, and there are ideas that are on the margins that, if they were sort of writ large, would actually lead to very problematic sort of conclusions. Like WikiLeaks, for example, like, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, they were lionized by a lot of sort of segments of society, but I think now they're being seen as somewhat more problematic, to say the least. So we probably need more granularity in the discussion rather than sort of just saying the
good and bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you agree, Chris?
I do, and you know, it's funny that you took those two examples, because I mean, Twitter was designed for protest. We didn't know that Odeo had used our source code for 5 years or so, and so it was this big surprise. And for 5 years, I was going to these conferences where people are like, "Can Twitter be used for protest?" and so it was a real surprise when actually one of the founders became vested, left, and then admitted that they had actually taken. And with WikiLeaks, I completely agree. Part of the reason that we ended our project was because we didn't understand how, from MIT or even from the United States, we could govern that leaking system, and that was actually a big question for us because we started getting all this data, the amount of infidelity, you know, and we didn't know where to put it or how we could actually incorporate, you know, the data in such a way that it wouldn't be easily captured. And unfortunately, I don't think Assange figured that out either, and he's heavily compromised.
Piotr, you would. I forgot you
Yeah,
because
like
of the dynamics of the discussion.
It's a very good one.
Yeah.
And I would like to come back to the question which you have asked, what we can do tomorrow.
Yes.
And I think there is, in my experience, there is one area which we all can act immediately on, and it is about public-private partnership. I truly believe that this can be done in much deeper and broader way, because the digital world will be done through that. There is a space and role for public services, there is a space and role for private businesses. And I can use the example of education. We all discuss here, okay, we have a problem, right? The education is not catching up enough with the technology. The old model, which doesn't help young people in the right engagement. There are multiple challenges there. Will public education transform itself without private sector? I don't think so. Will private sector replace public education? I don't think so. I think there is a space for partnership here, and we can do much better. I think public education should be more open for cooperation with businesses.
Is there a will for cooperation between public and private partners, or is it a must?
There is a will, but it is in a too small area. I think this should be pervasive. This should be everywhere. It should be, every teacher should be open to work with a local company and not have a problem with that. And also every CEO should have an understanding, not only my role is to make good business, it's also to be socially responsible. And to see what can I do to the local community, what can I do to the global community. And we have good examples of such programs happening. Yeah. And I think this is something which we can act on immediately.
We can, and there are front runners who are doing the right thing in our perspective, like really taking into consideration the societal impact, the positive societal impact. But there are so many when it comes to companies, but also maybe to institutions. They are not following up in the same speed. What could we do to seduce them, to give them incentives, to follow up? Because we have not much time to waste as things are changing so tremendously quick.
I think it's all about leadership.
It's about leadership.
Yes, because we can think about policy making and changing. Now, policy making is a long process. It has a lot of consultation, it has to be agreed. But the leadership of individuals, of leaders of regions, of companies, of countries and others, this is where the change may happen immediately.
Do we have a league of the true leaders? A lack, I must say.
Do we want to open a new conference? It's a big topic.
I think the politicians are way behind.
Are way behind,
yeah,
Kieran.
I mean, this pace of change is unprecedented, and I think politicians are very short-term people. They think to the next election. Many of them, not that there's the good, the bad, and the ugly politician, and also cities as well. In terms of, I'm 8 years now a council member. I'm an independent councillor, and I've seen myself that certain political parties will keep putting emphasis on housing and roads, and sometimes the things in terms of the future of work, the future of society, isn't being invested in. That it's we'll invest in 4 or 5 years, and then kind of beyond that we actually won't. Can I just to the question in terms of citizenship and so on? I think that we are producers and consumers. We're prosumers. I think it's a term that Jeremy Rifkin actually came up with, and I think we need to prepare people like this. The generation going through will have 3 to 4 careers. They'll be working beyond 9 to 5 hours. They'll be. I mean, many of the young generation we see on Facebook. If you go on Facebook, you'll see all these empowerment kind of slogans. You must do this, and you must do that, and you must save the world. And it's amazing. A lot of young people have an interest in trying to save the world or save the environment. And I think that's positive and negative. But in terms of the technology has also reconfigured us and what we actually believe in and our perception of the world. It's like technology has actually reconfigured our cities and regions and how we walk around them in terms of how we interact with kind of space and time and memory and all of that. Like the future of work is in these smart buildings. We're creating these.
I'm going to collect some questions here.
I've got a question to Chris. I think that I saw in one of your slides that technology should be legislation. How do we do this?
What I was pointing out was this guy, Andrew Feenberg, who says that technology is legislation. It's not that it should be legislation. It already is. So it defines our possibilities in many, many ways that are completely undemocratic. And so this is happening every day. The air that I breathe, the water that I drink, are all being affected by technologies in ways that aren't part of a public discussion. So it's already happening is the point.
Another question here.
Could you a little bit elaborate more on the urban-rural divide? And maybe some concrete examples, maybe from the Committee of Regions or other countries, also from the corporate perspective. How do you ensure that there are no losers? I mean, this has been debated for quite some time, the sort of digital divides of various kinds. But we still see, as you mentioned, the girl in rural Slovakia versus the cities and urbanization and everything being concentrated in cities and rural areas being somewhat disconnected, which is a bit ironic. Could you just, from different panelists, your perspectives on what is the way forward, how to build the infrastructure, skills, and connectivity? Thank you.
I know I've met a lot of people.
I'm interrupting you. I would like to have a short reflection for everybody. Okay, so just keep it short because it's super interesting. Yeah, you're first, Kieran.
There is a massive depopulation kind of going on across Europe. People are flocking to the capital cities because they don't have access to proper broadband. And I've met many, many people from rural areas that would say that they actually would stay in their town or their village if they actually had broadband and they'd develop a business. And we need to look at that. So, the Committee of the Regions is trying to stay on top of the pace of change. But I think the reality on the ground is that the people are migrating because of technology as well, and because technology is a chameleon. So we're doing our best. I'd say that our last 2 or 3 opinions that have actually went through to the European Commission have commented that we need to provide broadband in rural areas.
Okay, Piotr, what should we do?
Well, this is obviously all about the access to resources and services, right? If this will be equalized for everybody, there would be much easier way for every individual to choose their rural life. And I think we are on a good way. The broadband, yes, it's still not at the level where it should be from the perspective of availability for people in rural areas, but I think technology is going the direction that one day this will be equal, there will be no problem with that. The second aspect will be the virtualization of services and products, so that we don't have to be physically in a place to have access to the good healthcare service or the good education service or entertainment. And this is also changing. So I think it will be easier and easier in the years forward
to connect
for a girl in rural Slovakia to say, okay, I have no problem staying here. I have almost the same access to resources and services as my colleague in Bratislava.
Can you add something to it in response to the question of the lady?
I would say it's really about the access, and the local business turns global, because right now, for example, you can work from Košice or from the part which has really good access to the internet for Silicon Valley. So it's not anymore about the place where actually you are, but about the connection you have to the world.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, what would you?
Yeah,
reply?
So part of the reason I'm working in Africa is because I was working in rural United States and looking at kind of systemic inequalities between urban and rural areas. I think we need to really change the smart city debate. We need to really kind of change this idea of urbanization, because it's increasingly you see rural areas just don't have the rights that urban ones do. They don't have the opportunities, and it's not a question of them eventually equalizing. I would disagree. I think it's like saying, oh well, Usain Bolt is much faster than me, but I'll catch up with him eventually if you just wait long enough. I'll never catch up with Usain Bolt. You need to proactively say, how do we invest in rural areas? How do we rebalance the fact that there just aren't the opportunities. There's not the media centers. There's not the lobbyists. Nothing in the rural areas is equalized in power with the urban ones. So you really need to be very proactive about that and make it attractive for people to stay in rural areas. But that has to be done, again, I would say, by government and policy.
Yeah. In regions, in countries.
In regions and countries, yeah.
What's the European role in this, to make this develop, to make this run?
I don't know enough about policy to comment
Well,
on that.
but that's why your opinion is so interesting.
No, I mean, I do think that technology has a huge role to play in that. I just think that, by the time you have broadband rolled out in rural areas, we'll have, turned into robots or something like that in the rural areas. We'll still be catching up. And, I really see, I mean, Africa is a great example of this, but I was appalled by what I was seeing in the United States. I was specifically working on fracking, because fracking's been happening for 30 years in the United States, and it's only come on the radar about 10 years ago because it started encroaching near New York and Pennsylvania. So when it gets close to where the media is based, then people's summer homes are getting threatened, and all of a sudden you notice that there were these incredible cases of leukemia all over rural areas of the U.S. So this is it's a big deal. It's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Mehran, to catch up rural and urban areas, can you?
So I'll talk about connectivity in specific. If you look at why urban areas have connectivity and rural areas do not, it's a simple answer, which is that if you ask the ISPs, urban areas are population-dense places where their sort of per unit cost of making an investment is much lower than it is in the rural areas, where it just makes more financial sense for them to invest in urban areas than in rural areas, where populations are more spread out, higher income as well. So it doesn't make economic sense for them to go into rural areas. So either it's the state that goes in and absorbs the losses, or we deal with the issue as it is. So that's why we don't have access in rural areas. There are some interesting ideas that we're seeing being tested out where, so fixed line in my opinion is not the answer. We're seeing some ideas that are leapfrogging existing technologies to provide connectivity in remote areas. Google is doing something with Project Loon, where they're using balloons to provide internet access in remote areas. Facebook has Facebook Aquila, which they're using drones to provide internet access. SpaceX is experimenting with 8,000 satellites in space to provide satellite-based internet access. So I think the answer is probably going to be to leapfrog fixed line rather than, I don't see the private sector
again, you mentioned the names of the companies who seem to rule the world.
So I would, you know what I'm going to say. If you look at Libre Router, if you look at the developments in Berlin and Barcelona around ad hoc wireless networks that are peer-based and run by citizens, you're starting to see groups in Santa Barbara, and we're starting this research as well. We call it Communitelco. Basically very small GSM stations that can piggyback to each other. So I think access, there's two models. One is that I haven't seen a lot of successes in that area, but I think what will be really, really helpful is when people are starting to build ad hoc networks that connect to each other farther and farther.
Yeah, okay. Other questions, remarks? Yes, I come to you. I hand over the microphone.
Hello. You are all talking about the broadband, but for example, here in Slovakia, we had something like 90% of coverage of 3G internet here in Slovakia. And the diversity is being widening also here. So I don't think this is the right answer, because we got broadband, we got internet, we got good speed, we got access points for rural areas, but it doesn't work. So what next?
Yeah. What do you think is next?
Okay, you got me. I don't know. I really don't know, because this is the question. Because you are saying that teleworking is one part of the answer, but how do you can connect? How do you can persuade that these people in the rural areas have enough knowledge and skills to be really working for these biggest companies? How do you persuade them?
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is an interesting contribution because so that's not enough, the solutions. There must be more to really connect the remote areas and the Mehran, you.
Can I just make a broader point about this? I think this is a very important point where, so one big question is making the right investments. And then even, there are many instances, I would say majority of instances, where even when you make the right investments, you don't get the outcomes that you want. And that's not just in public sector, that's also in the private sector as well, where just buying a piece of technology off the shelf and then bringing it in and then bolting it onto your existing operations is probably not going to make a lot of difference. We did some research a few years back where the conclusion essentially was that only 5% of companies out there do digital well. They're able to optimize the returns on digital, whereas 95% of them simply invested them to look like the others. For every dollar that you spend on technology, you have to spend $9 on other process-related changes. And those are some of the things that people tend to forget. So if you simply think that going and buying broadband access is going to solve all connectivity issues, I think that's a mistaken assumption.
Okay, I have one other question, but maybe we can reflect slightly more on what you just said. But
yeah, I was just wondering about what we were talking. In Portugal, just recently, we had a big fire. Probably it was on the news all over the world, in a rural area where more than 60 people got killed because this telecom emergency system, which was sent to the private by the public authorities, did not work. That was part of we still don't know what is the reason for that. And I was completely devastated by this because it would have been very cheap to have these ad hoc networks in these places working and providing the population and even the authorities with the communication infrastructure that was needed to do that, but to do more important things like connecting the schools and making sure that people that live in these areas can have access to the internet. And that's one of the things that the EU could do, is you kind of fund and stimulate more of these citizen bottom-up initiatives to build infrastructure from the regions that are less developed and worry less about, you know, the big corporations that own all of the data. One of the things we are trying to do in MITI with Chris and the other groups is actually developing these infrastructures and giving back the small communities like in Madeira, in small regions, the small big data. It's unacceptable that Google or Facebook have more data about the cities we live in than the authorities in the municipalities and the governments. And we need to do something about that. And in order to do that, you need to fund these initiatives.
And you know, I'd say that Francesca Bria, formerly of Decent and Nesta, and now the CTO of Barcelona, is involved in a lot of cities are trying to actually start to build open platforms for city management, because they just find that, you know, if you have Podemos Barcelona values, the indicators that those platforms that you can buy and that are running most cities simply are not the indicators that they're interested in. And so they need to essentially not just work with those companies, because the companies' values will continue to be reinserted, but to actually develop open platforms where they can publicly deliberate what are the indicators and how is the software going to work.
We were saying, yeah, there should be funding put by the EU, but the structural funds are there, and they are especially for these less developed regions. And there is, with the new programming period, there is an obligation to spend in the first 4 thematic objectives, and one of these is digital development as well. So the money are there, so the next question is why eventually they are not spent?
Yeah, sure. And?
Because most of these regions, they will look at these projects like buying technology from the big corporations and installing it there, just to find out that 5 to 10 years later it doesn't work. So the problem is cultural, it's not technological. And the regional funds, they will try to follow up on these big corporate initiatives. Every politician is talking about Uber, is talking about Google, and wants to do that, even without understanding. They repeat these buzzwords. And unfortunately, the smaller the regions are, the more cultural the problem is.
Okay. Now, how are we going to address this challenge then? Because this is a challenge we face everywhere. So the money is there, it is spent, but not in the intention of how it was delivered, apparently. And I think we have had some examples of this also yesterday, and maybe it's also a bit of an answer to your question. How do we change culture that the money foreseen for a specific topic is truly delivered? Piotr?
I think it's an interesting discussion, but I think we went too much into the digital technology. And living in a village is not only about having connectivity and being able to connect with big companies or with nice services. The villages are nice. It's a nice place to live. I just briefly will share with you the example of one of the villages in Bavaria. They're called Wildpolsried, where the local community has decided to be the best user of green technologies. Not invite big companies. They wanted to develop this themselves. Today, they are absolutely independent of energy. They are generating more energy than they consume. And now they are thinking about how they can use the innovative solutions which they have developed in this village as products for others.
A great example, yeah.
Right? So we don't have to sit and wait and try to connect with big guys. We can do this locally and be proud of that.
It is done, but we try to find a discussion how to scale it up and make it really the difference, yes.
Yeah, sometimes I think that we are looking for a revolution, but what is needed is actually evolution. And because if we are looking on the big project, especially for the small villages, is something that you said, that it's really that they buy technology and stuff, but sometimes it's really about the supporting the initiatives, small projects, for example, a couple thousand of euros, and they can be spent really wisely, and then it's really about the bottom up, you know, so the projects will gain to bigger projects with the small projects at the beginning.
Yeah, modest, bottom up, sometimes with small amounts of money, but that is just enough to get it.
Yes, sometimes really, like 10,000 euros is really sufficient for a good project.
Great, we must time-wise. You have a question? Sure, or you were just waving then? Yeah, maybe a comment. Oh, you, no?
Mm-hmm.
to the stakeholders, to the mayor of small, medium cities and towns in Europe in order to help them to deliver broadband on site, whether with European money or not. So I think things are there, things are in place. We passed from 2 billion in the last programming period to 6 billion.
Okay.
Of course, when we talk about money, we will not speed up uptake of 5G technology with 6 billion euro in a market that is requiring more than 200 billion euro to spread G5. But of course, in rural areas, we can do a lot of stuff, and we are doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Thank you.
It does come down to political leadership as well. I mean, it does come down to the mayor of a town. I was in a major European city recently, and there was a series of agencies and associations, and it was a really, really good ecosystem, and everyone was enthusiastic. And they gave the point that it's not working. And I asked them, why isn't it working? And they said, the mayor of the town isn't interested in innovation. The mayor of the town is interested in short-term topics, and because of that, it's not getting onto the council chamber. And it's not. I mean, the EU are investing large sums of money. It's just sometimes it's not getting through. I was in another town, in a rural area.
Stop with the negative examples. No, I think that this is an important point, and just give me one positive example. That's maybe better.
The EU are doing their job in investing funding into cities and regions, and that needs to be acknowledged.
Involved. Okay. Great. Okay, so we can conclude. Yeah, no, and we do not, because we are running out of time. But if we can jump to one conclusion, then we say when it comes to making sure that digital innovation has a positive societal impact, it comes to leaders, it comes to us. And I would like to consider us as leaders, all in our own areas. So if we can make the change and really try to have an eye on not only that business and financial impact, but mostly that societal impact, because that's the way we should proceed from now. And yes, there are fortunately so many good examples, but we must do better. It's not enough. It's not good enough, so we must adapt there. I do thank you so much, and I had at least 100 other questions for you, but we leave it till now. Give them a warm round of applause. I see that Richard Tufts, he just left the room because he has to give us a report as a rapporteur after coffee. And I think, well, he tries to get all this into his report as well. So a quick coffee, and then I will ask you back for the rapporteur, Richard Tufts, for Stanislav Kmet, the director of the Technical University, and of course, the announcement for next year's WIRE. So see you in, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you again.